Okay, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, please send forth your Spirit upon us as we continue to learn through the wisdom of St. Ignatius of Loyola, your gift to the Church. Help us to understand and interiorize and carry out this teaching he has to help us resist the temptations of the enemy. We ask this through his intercession. Amen. Okay, let's see. Do you remember 3 months ago, maybe? I don't know if you were even in this class at that time. Rule 5, I think we covered this during Lent. Rule 5. It is, as I think I said last week, the most important rule of all the rules. Right? Rule 5.
I told you Rule 5.
Do we remember what Rule 5 is? Yeah. In time of spiritual desolation, never make a change to a spiritual proposal that we had made. Now, St. Ignatius of Loyola and Father Timothy Gallagher, tell us very plainly that this rule, is the most important because it will get us through the vast majority of darknesses and desolations that we come or receive really in life. The vast majority of them, right? Which is why it is the most important rule. Because even if we fail to do all the other rules, if we keep to Rule 5, we'll at least be okay. We will at least prevent most of the enemy's goals from being accomplished. So we never forget Rule 5. Never make a change in the darkness. Now, we are going to add to this Rule 13, which is the second most important rule, perhaps. These two rules together will get us through any darkness that we might face in our spiritual life, right? Never make a change in the darkness. And Rule 13, speak to a wise and competent spiritual person. Those two rules together will get us through any spiritual darkness we are facing. Okay, let's look at the rule then. So, if you remember, these rules are about resisting temptation specifically, the last 3 rules in his 14 rules of discernment. The 13th, likewise, he conducts himself as a false lover. So he is referring to the enemy. The enemy conducts himself as a false lover. If you remember from Rule 1, the enemy's pleasures are apparent. They're apparent pleasures. They seem so, but they're not really so. His reasons are false, that we learn from Rule 2. His reasons will seem very true, but they're not really true. Same here with the false lover, right? Seems to be reasonable again, but it's a false love. The enemy conducts himself as a false lover in wishing to remain secret and not be revealed. So this is what St. Ignatius wants to highlight with regard to the enemy's tactics. The enemy wants to remain secret. Specifically, he wants to have his suggestions remain secret and not be revealed. So that is the basic of it. Now we speak to the metaphor that he uses in the 3 last rules. For a dissolute man who, speaking with evil intention, makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father or a wife of a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be secret, and the contrary displeases him very much when the daughter reveals to her father or the wife to her husband his false words and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. So, we understand the metaphor there, right? The enemy has certain plans, and it will be very easy to accomplish those plans, or at least easier, if the person that is being tempted, is alone, right? If the person is alone, right, they hear the words, you can't talk about this thing with anyone, and the person believes that, it'll be much easier for the enemy to succeed with his undertaking of, destroying this person's spiritual life. Similar to the metaphor, obviously, with the false lover. All right, so now he's going to apply the metaphor in the same way. When the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. But when one reveals them, to who? So the idea is, one, you reveal them. Now he says to who? To one's good confessor, or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have been revealed. Again, this idea of, well, once you talk about this with someone who knows what's going on, the game is up, right? Particularly, right, the false lover with, let's say, the daughter to her father. The father's been around a lot longer than the daughter. He can see very clearly what this fool is up to with his daughter. And maybe she does not, right? She's more easily dissuaded. All right, that's kind of it. The enemy's tactic: keep these burdens secret. Right? The enemy wants the just soul to receive and drink in his words, his deceptions. Right? Again, that idea that they are alone, and that if they share these thoughts, right, or suggestions or imaginations with somebody else, the very bad things are going to happen. And so, just keep quiet mentality there is very powerful. Now, sometimes, well, not sometimes, it would be the enemy's goal to help this person keep secret these burdens for days or weeks or months or years, as long as possible, right? He tries to get this person to not open up to anyone about these burdens. And then the desolation, which goes along with the temptation, can stay as long as that continues. So, now the actual secrets that he wants us to keep are these things, right? Troubling, temptations, doubts, fears, burdens, right? These are the things that will try to get us to lose our peace in the spiritual life. If they are in us, then peace is just, they can't coexist at the same time as having these things. Now, it's possible for there to kind of be like an up and a down as we remember the troubling thing, and then we forget the troubling thing for a while, and then peace can come in. But as soon as we remember the troubling thing, right, then the peace leaves, right, which is the enemy's goal. Right, so specifically the troubling temptations, that would obviously be temptations to certain sins, right? Fears, that could be pretty much anything, but it'll likely revolve around one's spiritual life, but maybe one's vocation as well. Burdens, these can be in the form, as well as doubts. Actually, they all can be. Fears, burdens, and doubts will usually be in the form of lies from the enemy. The enemy is the father of lies, a murderer from the beginning. He very much wants us to accept his lies, and those lies will kind of give birth to, seemingly, again, very powerful fears and doubts and burdens that we do not need to accept. But if we do believe the lie, then those other things come. And again, his intention is, don't tell anyone about these burdens. Don't tell anyone about these temptations or these fears you have, So that's exactly the thing he wants us to keep secret about. Now, Yeah, I guess just to note, obviously, these types of things that the enemy will have us try and keep secret, I'm going to try and speak of them with great reverence, perhaps a greater reverence than I've attempted in the past for all the previous 13 rules, because this is obviously going to touch a place in our heart that is deeply personal. This is the darkest parts, the scariest parts. And again, this is the part that the enemy is going to keep poking. Right? These things, maybe events that we've never spoken to anyone about in our entire life. Maybe things that are happening right now that we have not talked about to anyone. Right? These are the type of things, perhaps, that the enemy is going to encourage us, again, to keep quiet. Otherwise, he knows the game is up. Sometimes he'll tell us, you can speak about other things, that are really important, but just not that thing, right? That thing is off limits. And again, usually that thing will be, quite troubling. So, that being said, we make an important distinction between, again, spiritual and the non-spiritual. Just like when we made a distinction between spiritual desolation and non-spiritual desolation, we need to understand the difference between those and be aware of those when that happens in our life, because the rules apply to spiritual desolation, right? And not to non-spiritual desolation. Even though maybe usually the rules kind of work, but for sure they're about spiritual desolation. Here, we're speaking of fears, temptations, burdens, right? The lies that have to do with our spiritual life. If a person undergoes certain trauma in their life, more psychological trauma, right? And they have psychological fears that have to do with another event that doesn't exactly have to do with one's spiritual life, then that person should not be applying Rule 13 to themselves, right? The idea that I need to go find a wise and competent spiritual person and talk to them about this. That person certainly does need to be freed from their captivity to these spiritual prisons, or not spiritual, psychological prisons, but they should go seek out competent psychological, experts, counselors, people who are trained to deal with that type of stuff, right? That is a different type of person than a wise and competent spiritual person, although perhaps sometimes that person has expertise in both. But those are different things, right? We need to make sure we, keep that in mind. Because we might look at Rule 13 and think, okay, I need to go find somebody and tell them everything that happened to me or something like this. And if that person is not capable of dealing with it, then that might actually produce more harm than good. Unless, of course, that person knows what they're doing. Again, someone who's trained in psychological healing and counseling can deal with that type of stuff. And those professionals, they are trained for this type of thing. They know that not everything needs to be revealed, in a first session or something. That this type of thing requires trust. That individual will know this, right? And they will not expect someone who goes to them to tell them everything, in an attempt to begin the healing process now. Although if you have the trust, then, why not? But do we kind of understand that distinction? It's an important distinction to make. But of course, having said this, it remains true that we may carry spiritual burdens in our life and have for some time that can be shared with the wise and competent spiritual person. And we can have freedom from them by doing so, right? But we just have to be personally aware of where does this lie on the spiritual, non-spiritual kind of spectrum there. So, with whom should we speak? He gives us two profiles of people to speak to. One, one's good confessor, who knows his deceits and malicious designs. So, one's good confessor. Confessor. This is a priest who hears confession. That is who this is talking about. A good confessor. So this is a priest who is not only devout, but who is knowledgeable, specifically about the enemy's deceits and malicious designs. There might be a priest, right, who, holy man, but just doesn't understand, let's say, these rules of discernment from, say, Ignatius of Loyola. He would not qualify for this spiritual profile. Someone who is not only devout, but knowledgeable, and really understands the workings of the enemy. And then one's good confessor, meaning a priest with whom one has a sufficient contact with in the sacrament of confession. That is who he's speaking of. For most of human history, you pretty much have your parish priest or someone like this, unless you happen to live next to a monastery or something. You have your guy, and that's the one you go to confession to all the time. In our world, you don't have to drive very far to find another priest or something, but this would be someone whom you have repeat contact with, partly so that person can kind of understand you, but also so that you can evaluate him, right? Is this a wise and competent, a good confessor? Anyways, that's who St. Ignatius is saying the person we should disclose things to, right? So that means just random people, Rule 13 does not apply to, right? We don't tell the enemy's tactics to just anyone, right? One's good confessor. The other profile that he gives us is another spiritual person. So this is not a priest. It might be a priest, it might be a confessor, but this is really anyone. They could be anyone in any vocation, right? Is this a spiritual person, right? Again, not just someone who's devout, and prays 10 rosaries a day or something, though that might make them a very spiritual person. This is someone who is, again, knowledgeable, who knows the enemy's deceits and malicious designs, right? So, the confessor one obviously is more restricted. This one, again, could be anyone in your life who you think qualifies for this. Okay, let's look at an example. Saint Therese. Y'all know or familiar with her story at all? All right, we'll go through it. So, this event that she is writing about occurs the evening before Therese professes perpetual vows for her Carmelite monastery, which is like, that's it. That's the end. Solemn profession. You're in for life. She's been in her convent for a while now, but there's like stages before you get to this point where it's like, all right, you're a nun. No going back. So this is obviously a big evening, right? Less than 24 hours. Her vocation is secured. All right, so if you don't know, Therese from a very early age was assured of her vocation. She knew deep down that she was supposed to be a Carmelite nun, right? She was 15. She's like, I want to go enter the monastery now, even though that was too young to enter the monastery. And so she went there, and the Carmelites were like, you're too young. Go ask the pastor here, the main guy in charge of us all. So she went to go ask the priest there, and he's like, yeah, you're too young to enter the monastery. So she's like, well, I know I'm supposed to enter a monastery. So then she went to the bishop, right? And she's like, Bishop, I want to enter the monastery. And he also said, you're too young, Therese, just wait a few years. But she knew in her heart, right, that this is what she was supposed to do. And though somehow, with her father's permission and her uncle's permission, they went to Rome, and she found the Pope, and she talked to the Pope and said, Holy Father, I want to be a Carmelite sister. And the Pope's like, well, if it's God's will, it'll happen, Now, the vicar general of her diocese happened to be there at that meeting, and this event saw her tremendous courage, this little 15-year-old girl, to go ask the Holy Father for an exemption to all these little rules. He was convinced of the authenticity of her vocation, and so he agreed, as being the one of authority in her town, that, okay, Therese can enter the monastery at 15, and so she did, and she was extremely happy, right? And everything was going well. She never, for a moment, doubted her vocation upon entering and before entering the monastery. Now, she is here after having lived years in this little convent here, she makes a retreat, as often happens before big life changes. And this retreat, certain amount of days, and it ends with her profession. So there's no gap between those two things. The retreat ends and boom, she's a nun, for life. So that's what's going on. This is the final day of that retreat. It is evening. The next morning, she will make her vows. So the community has gathered to pray the office, the divine office, which is prayed 5 times a day, maybe at her time 7 times a day. The nuns come together in the chapel and they pray the Psalms. This is how it works. So this is the last office. At the end of this evening prayer, there will be silence until the next morning when the vows, everyone will come back together at the church and they'll make the vows. And after evening prayer, usually the nuns just kind of sit in their little seat, meditate for a few minutes, and then they go to their rooms, and that's kind of it, So this is the context of this. The beautiful day of my wedding, which is just speaking of her vows that she's going to make the next day, finally arrived. It was without a single cloud. However, the preceding evening, a storm arose in my soul, the like of which I'd never seen before. Not a single doubt concerning my vocation had ever entered my mind until then. So, certainly difficult to find anyone in the spiritual tradition of the Catholic Church of someone who was so secure, right, and believed in their vocation. She knew from such a young age, and it had never entered her mind before this moment that she shouldn't be a nun, right? So, and it evidently was necessary that I experience this trial. So if you remember from our Lenten classes, Rule 9, sometimes the Lord allows spiritual desolation into our lives as a trial, as a testing for us. So she thinks this is why it happened. And again, she's very secure in this. In the evening, while making the way of the cross, after Matins, which is the final prayer that the sisters pray, my vocation appeared to me as a dream, a chimera. I found life in Carmel to be very beautiful, but the devil inspired me with the assurance, right? That's a strong word. She is assured now that it wasn't for me and that I was misleading my superiors by advancing on this way to which I wasn't called. The darkness was so great that I could understand one thing only. I didn't have a vocation. How can I possibly describe the anguish in my soul? So we could probably perhaps catch a glimpse of that anguish again. Never had she doubted it. And here, on the eve of her perpetual vows, she knows one thing for certain, that she has no vocation, right? Her whole life's about to explode. It appeared to me, right? And this is the absurdity that shows that it was a temptation. So she's very clear in understanding the spiritual realities here. That it was a temptation from the devil. That if I were to tell my novice mistress about these fears, she would prevent me from pronouncing my vows. All right, so let's imagine here. Well, really what's being imagined by Therese here at this moment. There's an imagined scenario going on in her head. 1, I feel I have no vocation. This has all been a lie. There's that big fear. If I go, she's seeing herself going to her novice mistress, saying, hey, let's talk. She imagines herself talking to her. She imagines herself telling her novice mistress that she has this big fear that she's not supposed to be a nun. Then she sees her novice mistress nod her head gently and say, well, okay, we'll cancel the procession tomorrow. And then she imagines herself, that's it. She packs her bags and she imagines herself going back to her home and back to her family. And that's it. So that's what she imagines, right? All right. Yeah, basically what we need to get out of that is an extremely painful scenario that she is imagining at this moment. And still, I wanted to do God's will and return to the world rather than remain in Carmel and do my own will. So Therese never wavers in wanting to do God's will. She is simply confused about what God's will actually is. Right now she's convinced it is God's will for her to leave the monastery. So what happens? I made the novice mistress come out of the choir. Okay, so they're in this place of common prayer where they always pray the Psalms together. All the sisters are there, and then they all see Therese leave her little spot and go talk to her superior. And that's going to take a tremendous amount of courage, because everyone knows, and she knows this, that if someone right before the eve, of their profession goes to talk to their superior when that would not be, normal, everyone's going to be thinking, there's trouble here, But she does it in front of everyone because she knows this is the last time she has before it's silent and it's done and she's going to be professed. So she goes over there. And filled with confusion, right? This is not easy for her. I told her the state of my soul. Fortunately, she saw things much clearer than I did, and she completely reassured me. So her novice mistress is a wise and competent spiritual person who knows the deceits and malicious designs of the enemy and sees very clearly that this is a temptation from the enemy, right? She reassures Therese, of course you have a vocation, Therese. That's just the enemy. Let's go to bed now, Now, what happens after this? The act of humility I had just performed put the devil to flight, since he had perhaps thought that I would not dare admit my temptation. So again, this is precisely Rule 13 here. Keep quiet, Therese. Don't tell anyone about this big fear you have, But she had a great act of humility, a great act of courage, spoke to a competent spiritual person, and the gig was up, right? Nice try, devil. Got close, I guess, but not going to happen. My doubts left me as soon as I had finished speaking. So, Father Timothy Gallagher says you can take these words, embroider them in some super fancy thing, frame them, and hang it on your house somewhere in your wall. These words, my doubts left me as soon as I had finished speaking, which is to say, just the act of putting into words the temptation. You almost don't even need another human person there to listen to it, just so you could hear it said out loud, right? Her novice mistress had not even responded yet to her. She just let it out. And then she says, my doubts left me completely as soon as I even said it. And then her novice mistress does reaffirm her that this is her vocation. Okay, so let's compare then the imagined scenario she had before to the real scenario, right? This super painful imagination of what's going to happen when she tells her novice mistress and she goes home for the rest of her life, versus that isn't what happened at all, right? Her competent, wise, and spiritual person knew exactly what was happening, and her doubts they were gone, right? And she was reconfirmed in her vocation, right? Is what she says, a river of flowing peace, right? Nevertheless, to make my act of humility even more perfect, I still wish to confide my strange temptation to our mother prioress, who simply laughed at me, right? So if we remember one of the rules from Rule 6, what does St. Ignatius recommend us to do if, let's say, we plan to pray our normal prayer period, but we're tempted to shorten the prayer period? What does St. Ignatius say maybe we should do? Instead of shortening that prayer period,
add on to
just a little bit, maybe a minute or two, right? Just to pound the enemy into dust, right? That not only you're not going to do what he wants, you're going to do slightly more of what he doesn't want, right? And this is what she does. She already told her wise and competent spiritual person, but she still wanted to crush, all traces of the enemy. And so she goes and even tells the mother superior of the whole place. And of course, the exact same thing happens. She laughs. I mean, she's seen this 1,000 times. How many women, young girls, have gone through her convent and had the same fears the night before? She knows exactly what this is, right? So Therese puts into effect Rule 6 here and utterly destroys the enemy's temptation. In the morning of September 8th, I felt as though I were flooded with a river of peace, and it was in this peace which surpasses all understanding that I pronounced my holy vows. So what is Therese experiencing at this moment? Oops. What is it? What is she experiencing on the day of her vows? A river of peace?
Spiritual
consolation. That's right, spiritual consolation for sure. Well, we don't need to go back to that. Oops. Okay, so let's run through some scenarios here. Of course, there's the imagined and the real. This is the thing we should kind of remember about this rule, right? When we're in the moment of the burdens, right, the imagined scenario is going to be extremely painful. We'll be thinking about who would I tell about this thing, and we imagine it, and it's going to go very poorly in our imagination, right? But if this person really is a wise and competent spiritual person, that is not going to be the reality of what happens, right? So what if that evening Therese had not spoken with her novice mistress despite having the fears? And then she next morning made her profession just in great fear, right? Would she have made her profession in a river of peace, flowing river of peace? No, even though she was called to the novitiate. But because she kept it secret, this great moment of consolation was completely robbed from her because she would have kept silent, right? Now, that's actually very important because we all know the vocations will be tested and severely tested sometimes. And when that finally comes along for Therese, she's going to hear that voice that was always there, you know. See, Therese, you were never called to be a nun. You knew that the day you made your profession, right? And here you are in this great period of trial, time to go, you know. But because she did talk to her novice mistress and she did have that river of peace, she would always know going forward, right? That no, this is my vocation, and would be able to persevere through those periods of intense trial. So, second question. What if that evening Therese had spoken, but not to her novice mistress, but to one of her fellow sisters who was about to make a profession the next morning? Someone who was on the same level as her spiritually. What might have happened, right? Who knows, right? Again, these are people who are not spiritually competent and are not familiar with the deceits of the enemy, right? She probably would not have made her profession of final vows in a river of peace, but again, always going forward, she would know. That person didn't really know what they were talking about. You know, I don't have a vocation after all. Or she talks to someone and they say, wow, Therese, what are you doing here? You need to leave right now. You can't make profession tomorrow. This is crazy. You're not called. Again, because they don't know what they're talking about. So that's why it's important not just to speak to somebody, but to speak to someone who knows what they're doing. Okay. All right, Thomas Martin. We'll skip that example, I think. But basically the same thing happens. He was very confused, but spoke to someone who knew what they were doing, and that was the end of all his anxiety. Okay, so we seldom might express the enemy's urgings this clearly, but if we were to just kind of write it out, of what would it sound like with the enemy's words in our heads, it would be something like this, right? There is something I need to say, but, but what? He is too busy, right? We're thinking of someone who's a wise and competent, maybe the good spiritual or a good confessor, and we think he is too busy. Right? The response to that is, let him make that decision, right? He knows if he's too busy, but the devil's going to want to say, he's too busy. Don't bother. Don't risk it. Don't try. I need to tell someone, but I'm too busy, right? Now, it might happen that there is a week or 2 weeks in which we are very busy. But if 3, 4, 6 months go by and we haven't found someone and we're still too busy, now's the time we even might be thinking, maybe Rule 13 applies right now. Maybe this is the enemy trying to get me to stay silent, stay alone. He will laugh at me. While this probably is the most painful scenario described in that imagination, if this person really is a wise and competent spiritual person, they will most certainly not laugh. They will in fact have a great respect for the courage that it took to speak to them about this. They will show great reverence. I need to tell someone, but she won't be able to understand me. Again, if this person is a wise and competent spiritual person, they most certainly will understand because they have been there before. Other thoughts? I need to tell someone, but he will lose respect for me. A genuine, competent spiritual guide will not lose respect, but will actually gain respect for that person. Again, because of the courage they know it takes to break the silence. I need to tell her, but she will end the direction. Right? So presumably this person already has a spiritual relationship with a competent and wise spiritual person, perhaps in spiritual direction. And so they've talked about a lot of things, and lots of good have happened there. She really likes that, guide in her life, but she thinks, if I tell her this thing that's always burdened me, then she'll end it, right? She'll think, this is the imagined scenario. Well, if that's who you are, then we have to call it quits. I can't deal with you, right? But again, that is a lie. Why talk about it? There's nothing anyone that can say that will help. So this is obviously untrue, as experience repeatedly shows, both in the life of the saints and in our own life, if we ever have, done it. Conversely, if we think about those times in which we did try and handle it on our own and figure it out on our own, how often were we still just, the hamster in the wheel, running and running and running and not getting anywhere, just getting very confused. But when we tell somebody, even putting the burden into words, again, almost, not quite, but almost, if nobody was even there, just to speak it or write it out, can rob a lot of the power from the enemy, and the healing can begin effectively. So Pope Benedict XVI, he has some good words on this. To advance toward the Lord, this is what we're all called to do, not stay stagnant, but move forward closer towards the Lord. To advance toward the Lord, we always have need of a guide. Truer words, have they ever been spoken? We always have need of a guide, of a dialogue. We can't do it with just our own reflections. And finding this guide is part of the ecclesial nature of our faith. This is why, one of the reasons, Christ founded a church. It's not just me and Jesus. We have a whole structure that God has instituted and formed so that we can find spiritual guides in our life. This is what Ignatius always presumes, Man is not meant to be alone, That's not just husband and wife. That's just a natural human experience broadly. Man is not meant to be alone. We assume that we have people in our life who are farther along in the journey than us, who we can consult, Because that's how the church is built. Now, this is the big question, I guess. How do I find accompaniment on this spiritual journey? Couple options. Spiritual direction is the most obvious. That is what St. Ignatius of Loyola would have in mind. Like an hour meeting every month or so. And if it's early on, maybe more than that. Yeah, again, with a competent spiritual director, you just find one. It's kind of easier now than ever because there's online and telephone spiritual direction. So, you don't need insurance for that. There's websites for that. You can find that stuff. Confession, not as good because it can't be as long, but sometimes that's all a person needs to do. Again, if they've never spoken about these things to anyone in their life, confession might be a place to do it initially because of the seal, right? You can at least have the security that that's not going anywhere, and maybe behind the screen, so that way there's no break in the relationship. Not that that would actually happen, but little ways to help, right? And sometimes the confessor's little brief words can be of tremendous help in this regard, especially if we've never spoken about it to anyone. Retreats, yes, annual retreats are incredibly helpful in the spiritual journey. One, because retreats will always have a competent spiritual person there. Whoever's running it is going to get a priest, to be there to do spiritual direction or something like this. So this can be a single day retreat, a weekend retreat, or, more than that. Our seminarian Jacob here, you guys saw at Mass, he is going to do a 30-day retreat beginning in July. Super intense, doing the Ignatian exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. But we don't need to do that, right? There are opportunities in our diocese and around for little retreats, right? Single day retreats, weekend retreats, those can be very helpful. Spiritual friends. So this is not a spiritual director. This is somebody who's on your same level, more or less. They're not going to give you direction for your spiritual life. But again, just getting somebody's second opinion, objective view on the situation. Usually other people see things more clearly than we see. That can be very helpful, although they can't really be the spiritual director per se. Spouses, similar to the spiritual friend things, but it's kind of a unique relationship in that regard. The parish. So a parish should have groups and activities that aid in spiritual formation, such as this class. And we'll try and keep doing more stuff. And then a mixture of these. So obviously, more than one of these is going to strengthen. It's going to have a kind of an exponential effect in the effectiveness of these things if we can get multiple of them. All right, so Rule 13 is decisive in sustaining the spiritual life, the discerning life. The rest of the rules are usually for particular instances of spiritual temptation or darkness, right? And again, Rule 5 can get us through pretty much all of that. But on the whole, right, our spiritual life, we are going to have moments when we're just not going to know what to do, right? After trying to become aware and applying the rules and looking at it, and we're just still confused, those will eventually happen in our life. And it's in those moments that we need to speak to a wise and competent spiritual person, right? If we don't have that, how far can a person go in their spiritual life before eventually, right, the devil gets them, Okay.